Okay, so thank you for tuning in today to our presentation on Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting. I'm Sarah Fryer and I am Operations Director at Swan Energy, and I'm here with my colleague Robert Knowles, who is a carbon consultant at Swan Energy. We have been asked by the Energy Institute to deliver this presentation, which seems quite timely. All of a sudden it's coming to the surface that 11,000 organisations across the UK are to be involved in streamlined energy and carbon reporting, and for some, the collection of data will have already begun. I must ask first of all, before we start, that anybody who would like to ask a question at the end, if you are not happy for your audio to be recorded, because we are hoping to save this presentation and post it online in various different places. If you are not happy for your voice to be recorded, then please can you type your question rather than actually speaking it, and we will be able to respond appropriately. So we'll go through the whole presentation and then we'll have quite a while for questions and answers.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. And as Sarah said, my name's Robert and I'm just here. I'm a carbon consultant at Swan Energy working with Sarah. And I must just say thank you to Richard for hosting us today. We're just going to try and talk a bit about the background to SECR, why it was implemented, what the government thinks its goals are going to be. Obviously, who is going to be involved, because there may be some of you out there who aren't actually sure, and then if you are involved, whether or not what about the differences between quoted and unquoted companies, etc., and what you may actually have to do. And then, in addition, we're just going to talk about ways in which you for your report. Go through each thing in detail just to make sure you're up to date on that. Then we'll go through at the end a little bit of voluntary reporting that isn't necessary, encouraged, and then an example has been put together from a real-world example that we can draw on to just see a bit more about how implementing your SECR report into your financial statement. So, just to get going, it's not, this SECR isn't a replacement for CRC, or many people kind of see it that way. It's sort of coming along as part of the government's 2017 Clean Growth Strategy as CRC has been phased out. And in fact, if any quote companies or any organisations here today that in the past have had to undertake mandatory greenhouse gas reporting, this, well, very similar, it does replace it in some respects. It brings a few more extra reporting burdens, which we will talk about later. Of course, there's going to be many people who are thinking, oh, this is going to be very difficult for my company, more red tape, etc., etc. However, the way the government has justified it, and take this with a pinch of salt or interpret it your own way, the government considers that streamlined energy and carbon reporting will, quote, strengthen green credentials in the marketplace. Take from that what you will. And it's also going to be publicly available, and we really would like to be stressing this because it is definitely going to be seen as something which the public will be getting engaged with, and particularly activist groups, perhaps Greenpeace or Extinction Rebellion, will be holding people to account. So if there's any further voluntary requirements that aren't necessarily under the scope of SECR, that is why that is. And then finally, I suppose the most important thing, if you know absolutely nothing about SECR, is when you would have to report. So the legislation came into effect on the 1st of April 2019, and your SECR report has to be lodged with your first report for the full financial year after this date. So, for example, some people may be reporting this year if your financial year is 31st of March. However, if your financial year is the 1st of January to 31st of December, then because your first full financial year doesn't take place until 2020, you won't be obliged to report until 2021. So just to make sure that's clear. Now, this is a flowchart that the government has put together, a little bit small on your screens. However, the first thing, if you don't know anything about SECR, the first thing to consider would be if you are a quoted company or not. And then that would basically mean if you're listed on the London Stock Exchange or anywhere in the European Economic Area as well, or being or dealing on the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ. And then after that, it's going to be, who aren't involved in the stock exchange, it's going to be if you're defined as a large company, which, Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong, is 250 employees, 18 million turnover, 18 million on your balance sheet or more, 36 million turnover. And if you meet 2 out of those 3, then you are going to be involved in SECR. And then what would you actually need to report? So this is where the difference between quoted and unquoted, what you need to report. So if you're a quoted company, it's going to be all of your Scope 1 emissions and all of your Scope 2 emissions on a global basis. And then if you're unquoted, it's just going to be some UK energy use, which at a bare minimum has to be your electricity, your gas, and your transport, for which you are responsible for the consumption of fuel. So think things like paying out mileage to employees, hire vehicles, that sort of thing. And of course, the associated greenhouse gas emissions. In addition to this, it's necessary to report your previous year's energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. Though, of course, since this is going to be the first year, no one is obliged at this point to report on that. Intensity ratios, which we'll be talking about in a little bit more detail later, and also energy efficient actions and details on your methodology used. So just to talk a little bit about your intensity metric, this is the main way in which the government sees that the publicly available information, the nature of SECR being publicly available, will help companies to get more involved in reducing their emissions, because there's going to be comparisons between similar organisations. So, for example, if you are a cola beverage producer, highly likely that activist groups will be comparing you with a competitor just to see who's got the highest intensity of carbon emissions per ton of product, for example. And this metric does depend on the nature of your operations, of course it does. So if you produce some products, then it will be purchasing the product, you would like it to be that. Or if you're more service-based, then perhaps full-time equivalent will be more suitable, so your number of working hours. Now, something which isn't very clear, but is probably something worth bearing in mind, is make sure it is properly tailored to the nature of your organisation and is suitable for comparison. So, for example, if you are a organisation, you may choose to have a CO2 intensity metric of tonnes of CO2 per £1 million of turnover. However, with that, it does need, when you're comparing that across years, that will need a bit of context. Because, for example, you might have just signed a particularly large business deal, in which case your turnover may have doubled, but your CO2 emissions may be effectively the same. So it would seem as though your carbon intensity is halving. However, that's only because your turnover has doubled. So we would encourage everyone just to kind of think carefully about the suitability of this metric that you choose to implement. Because, as I mentioned, it will be compared year on year. It's only necessary to compare with the previous year. However, there's going to be lots of things out here that I'm saying the government strongly advises you to do, the government encourages you to do, but again, the government does encourage people to disclose the previous 5 years once it's available. Now, energy efficient actions. So this is something which the ESOS was heavily criticised for by certain people in the industry, and that was that there was no particular way of ensuring that any opportunities identified within your ESOS report would have to be acted upon. So once this, and of course the ESOS report wasn't publicly available, however, Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting will be, and you are required to disclose any energy efficient actions you are taking. And this may range from things as simple as implementing behaviour change programmes, so encouraging staff to reduce energy emissions where possible. This is going to slightly be some low-hanging fruit, and probably will be a lot of people reporting saying they are doing this, but it's a perfectly valid way of trying to bring down your energy consumption and your CO2 emissions. And then obviously the slightly more obvious ones like introducing smart meters and swapping over from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles. Now then, something that I must stress really is that it's not obligatory to be undertaking energy efficient actions during the year. However, if none are undertaken, then it must be explicitly stated in the report. And this is something that kind of comes back to that public accountability. If you put in your Streamlined Energy Carbon Report, no actions were undertaken for the calendar year 2020, it's not going to be really good luck for your organisation, especially when there's going to be other organisations that will be competitors to you who are doing quite a bit more. Now, when it comes to determining your consumption, this is probably something that is going to be the main area that a lot of people are going to be struggling with, about how they might have to do it, what requirements there must be, and helpfully or unhelpfully, depending on how you see it, there's going to be no prescribed methodology, but it must be, and again this is a quote, robust and widely accepted. So there is scope for interpretation on that, but however, some reporting practices that we would recommend looking at if you're looking to do this yourself would be Greenhouse Gas Reporting Protocol or any ISO standards, the GRI Sustainability Reporting Guidelines. And then, of course, if you're involved with any other schemes in the past, such as ESOS, EU ETS, CRC, or CCA, any data from that will be accepted as part of an SECR report. So there is room for organisations who already have some experience with carbon and energy accounting to kind of move on to SECR with some structures and procedures in place. Now, within determining your consumption data, there's going to be a distinction drawn between what is directly determined and what is indirectly determined. So directly determined data is going to be things like meter data or any invoices, so your gas and electricity invoices. And then once you've got your consumption data in kilowatt hours, it's going to be just a matter of determining the CO2 emissions from that by use of the standard emissions factors, which are on the website and updated annually. So make sure that if you are using government emissions factors and not determining them yourselves for any gas analyses or anything like that, that you are using the most up-to-date factors each year. And then in addition, during CRC there was a legal requirement for energy suppliers to produce a statement showing the consumption during that period. That legal requirement is no longer there. However, was definitely a way in which many organisations streamlined their CRC energy reporting procedures, and it's definitely something worth looking into if you were previously involved with CRC. Now, the opposite end to directly determining consumption data will be indirectly determining consumption data. So obviously it's not always reasonable to directly get that data. There's going to be data gaps, there's going to be areas where you're going to have to use estimations of some kind. So the government has proposed three main types of estimation, which Sarah in just a few moments will go over in a bit more detail. And they're direct comparison, pro rata extrapolation, or interpolation, depending on where the data gap would be, and benchmarking. Now, they're not the only, when Sarah goes through some examples, these are the only areas that you'll have to use. Any relatively sensible method of determining any data can be used, such as if you have fuel cards for your business, say, and then you only have a number of, you only have a monetary value on that fuel card rather than consumption data, then it's a relatively simple calculation to find the fuel use from that. So anything like that, which may be a bit more, which is kind of a more obvious data gap methodology, is perfectly acceptable to use, as long as it's explained properly and fully. And then Sarah's just going to talk a little bit now about some of the examples for estimating data, and then she'll talk a bit more on the other aspects of this.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Okay, so estimating data consumption. We've decided to focus a little bit on this because we feel that for organisations, this is the bit where they will struggle. So for some organisations who have been doing other sorts of energy management, energy reporting for many years, this is part and parcel. They will probably understand it. However, for others, if you come across a data gap, which we are anticipating quite a number of organisations due to the fact that we've heard that a lot of organisations don't necessarily know about SECR and are not ready for it. But as Rob discussed earlier, for some, the collection of data has already begun. So they could find when they get to complete their financial reports that they don't have the data available. So the first example that we have got here is direct comparison. So the example shows, an example here is the retailer, and they have come to fill in their SECR report and they have realised that they don't have any, in this case, natural gas consumption data from January to June. So the method that they have used is calculating an average of the previous 3 years, month by month, and then adding a 2 times standard deviation to create the proposed consumption for this year. Now, this is a perfectly fine estimation to use. Obviously, it's detrimental to the organisation in terms of if you look at that proposed 2019 value, it's substantially higher than the 2018, 17 and 16 values. However, in these cases, it's much better to be conservative than to underreport. Again, this is all about transparency. So as long as your methods are conservative, transparent, well explained, then there shouldn't be a problem and you should be able to use methods such as these.
Yeah, and the other thing as well is, of course, unlike perhaps CRC, there's no allowances to pay for at the moment in terms of your consumption and your emissions. So even though, as Sarah mentioned, this might seem like a bit 2 times standard deviation over an average might seem a bit extreme, there's no financial penalty involved.
Exactly.
The only advantage is, of course, that you're definitely making sure you're capturing all the data.
Exactly. Okay, so the next one up is quite a simple pro rata extrapolation. So this is if, for example, your reporting year finishes on the 31st of December or 1st of Jan 2020, and you don't have for that specific day, you can calculate that quite simply from using any data set that you have around it. So in this example, we have data from the 22nd of December and the 29th of December, and that has simply been extrapolated so that we can create a value on the 1st of Jan 2020. Our third data estimation is benchmarking. So this is using a proxy to estimate consumption elsewhere. So this could be to plug a data gap, or it could be if your organisation has many sites, it might be a way of scaling a few sites in order to get a total without having to actually do the work at each of the sites. So for example, if a chain of 10 has over 100 pubs nationwide, they could get the data for 10 if they're all similar and if they have similar energy profiles, which would be the important bit. Then they can find their metric from that, as Rob was discussing earlier. So in this case, the per square metre, and we've got the results on this page, scale it up, and therefore you've only done the work for 10 sites out of the 100, and you've still got your answer. Again, if you're going to use methods like this, then they must be explained and they must be made clear. Okay, so how do organisations report? So, as Rob mentioned, there is no prescribed methodology. However, the report must contain all the bits that we've gone through, so the intensity metrics, the energy efficient actions, and your actual data. The government has got a reporting template which you can access online. However, it's up to you and also your financial teams as to how this is put together, because we recognise that company reports look different depending on who your financial auditors are, and also how your company wants to present it themselves. It's up to you. But if you are struggling, then there is guidance available from the government on that. The government are quite keen for people to use their template, because it will then be able to show a bit of consistency and you'll be able to compare more easily between installations. But that's at your discretion. It has to be lodged with the director's report and it will pass through your audited accounts. Now, some auditing bodies are gearing up for SECR, some don't seem to be as much. It has to be signed off by the director and the board, but it should be recognised that your financial auditing body are only obliged to ensure that the data is consistent with the financial data. So, for example, Rob, you discussed earlier about if your turnover compared to your emissions.
Yeah, exactly. So that was an example of if you're turning from a service-based organisation and then you choose a metric of tons of CO2 per ton of turnover, that may not necessarily be suitable. However, of course, if you are if you are a cement manufacturer, for example, and you have an intensity metric which is kilograms of tons of CO2 per ton of product, if your output of cement doubles, say, but your intensity ratio stays the same, that should be something that gets flagged up, because then your consumption and your emissions aren't necessarily consistent with the other things which are in your financial report, which may be revenue from sold products. So this is the kind of the type of checking that the auditors should be doing.
Yeah. We also anticipate that the first few years might be a little bit, everybody's getting their heads around it, but then after that we imagine that people will be very much geared up and possibly there will be more formal verification processes going forward. So we've just taken a couple of pages. So this is from the Sovereign Grant and Sovereign Grant Reserve annual report, and they have been reporting their Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3, which we'll discuss in a little bit already. So on this page you can see their tonnes of CO2, they've compared it to 2018 as well, and then they've also reported their energy consumption in kilowatt hours. Okay.
And also this is screenshot and lifted straight from the director's report. So this is the kind of layout that you might want to be putting in place. And no editing of this data.
So voluntary reporting. So as I just mentioned then about Scope 3. So SECR only mandates you to report Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. However, you can report Scope 3 voluntarily. Scope 3 are things within your supply chain. So if you're a manufacturer, for example, the carbon emissions associated with the raw materials that you use would be included in your Scope 3 emissions. It's quite complex, but if you be completely transparent to your clients, if there is a need for you to do that, then it would be highly recommended. As well as this, you may want to report on your renewable generation. You don't have to, you're under no obligation to. However, again, if you have gotten to the investment and you are generating your own power on site, then it looks good for your clients and it's good for corporate social responsibility. On the same line, carbon offsetting, although this won't affect your tons of CO2 reporting, obviously it's good for your social responsibility, so it would be encouraged. As we've mentioned many times, it's publicly available, so it's very beneficial for customers and consumers to be able to understand exactly what it is that your organisation are doing and putting in place to reduce their carbon and to reduce their energy consumption. Okay, and to verification. So currently there are no formal verification requirements. As discussed earlier, they have to be consistent with financial statements. Some consultancies, Swan Energy are offering validation services as well as consultancy services, and we know of other consulting bodies and auditing and accounting bodies who are doing similar. So although there is no formal requirement for verification, if you are an operator and you're putting together your report and you're not entirely sure about whether you've done it right, whether you've missed anything, then there definitely are services available to help you to get that checked, and so that you're confident to send that up to your board of directors and include within your financial statements. Okay, so that is the end of our presentation.